House fires. A nightmare scenario for so many people out there, and one we all hope to never experience. But what would you do if you were to lose your newborn baby to such a scenario, only to receive the shock of your life over half a decade later? Now, sometimes we can discover truths through unconventional or even bizarre means. But have you ever had your world changed by a birthday party, bubblegum, and watching CSI? Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, folks. My name is Adrian, and welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime. Today we're looking at the bizarre case of Delimar Vera. Now, this story can be summed up in one word: unbelievable, in absolutely every conceivable way. In fact, not even Hollywood look at this story without laughing in its face. And before we dive into this rollercoaster of a story, I'd love to thank Babbel for sponsoring today's video. So many people recommended Babbel to me before it became a long-term sponsor of the channel, and I can clearly see why. It's a really good language learning app that you can use to learn many different languages. In fact, it's the #1 language learning app in the world, with over 10 million subscriptions worldwide. Whether it's for travel, connecting with loved ones, professional development, or even self-improvement, there are plenty of languages to choose from. Their courses are extremely easy too, and teach real-world conversations. With friends and family overseas in Germany, Babbel's fast and efficient way of learning helps me learn even with a busy schedule. Which is, of course, why I use the app during my morning coffee while I'm waking up.
Die Stadt ist von Bergen umgeben.
Die Stadt ist von Bergen umgeben.
Babbel is scientifically proven to help you start speaking a new language in just 3 weeks. Give it a shot, there's nothing to lose, as Babbel offers a 20-day money-back guarantee. So click the link in the description below or scan the QR code to get a massive 60% off your subscription. Thank you to Babbel for sponsoring today's video. Thank you to you folks for supporting us content creators, and now let's get straight back into today's case. Please grab yourself a coffee, pull up a seat, and get ready for the deep dive. This is the case of Delimar Vera. Welcome to Philadelphia, the 6th most populous city in the United States, the 2nd largest behind only New York City, and one filled with years of history. Although most of you out there will be familiar with the world-famous Philly cheesesteak, Philadelphia has so much more to offer. Whether it's their annual Mama's New Year parade, the city's extensive jazz scene, or countless art museums, you'll never be short of entertainment and intrigue. Being the biggest city in Pennsylvania, it is also the 9th most congested city for road traffic in the United States. But getting around is still made easy with its well-equipped public transport system. Supported by a relatively low cost of living, it is no surprise that it's a popular and rapidly growing place to live. And of course, we can't talk about Philadelphia without mentioning Always Sunny, can we? The city is comprised of over 25 unique neighborhoods, ranging from highly affluent and fancy, all the way through to the friendly bustle of honest working-class folks. And it's in one of those latter neighborhoods, located on Hurley Street, that we meet the folks of today's case. Las Cuevas, aged 25, and Pedro Vera were Puerto Rican immigrants. They lived happily together with their 2 sons, Wilfredo and Israel, who were aged 5 and 4 respectively. While Luz stayed home with the children, Pedro worked very hard to support the family as a mechanic. The family of 4 lived in a small but comfortable 2-floor townhouse. And in December of 1997, they were about to expand their family once again. It was on December the 5th, 1997, that the couple welcomed their first daughter into the world. And her name, Delimar Vera, will be today's case subject. With dark hair, dimpled cheeks, and big brown eyes, she was the apple of their eye, and needless to say, the family doted on her from day one. Now, both Pedro and Luz did not have a strong grasp of the English language, and instead spoke their native language, which was Spanish. While not necessarily a problem in their day-to-day lives, it was when Delimar was born that Pedro did not quite understand what was needed when signing the birth certificate. In the end, and not wanting to sign something that Pedro didn't quite understand, he kept his name off this birth certificate, which is something that's crucial to remember later in today's case. Both Pedro and Luz had large extended families that lived relatively close to the couple, and family members would often drop by around the family home. This frequency of visitation only increased after the birth of Delimar, and many family members wanted to help the couple with their newborn baby. So it was no surprise when, on December the 15th, one of Pedro's cousins came to visit, and her name was Carolyn Correa. Not only had Carolyn never been to the home before, but she had only met Luz once. And with Pedro out repairing her car, the conversation between the two women was reportedly very strained and stilted. The two seemingly had very little in common to talk about. The only thing that Carolyn could relate to Luz with was the fact that she also had a baby recently, although this baby was not with her at the time. To try and break up the awkward atmosphere, Luz tried to make herself busy by putting Delimar to bed in the front upstairs bedroom. She then carried on with the household chores while Carolyn waited for Pedro to finish the repairs. Eventually, though, Carolyn left the house abruptly, only to return a few minutes later to say she had forgotten her purse upstairs in one of the bedrooms. She then departed and disappeared, leaving Luz with her 3 children in the house. Luz continued with her housework, but before getting much further, she heard a deafening banging noise coming from the 2nd floor, and worryingly, it seemed to be coming from Delimar's room. She immediately ran upstairs to see what the noise could have been, but upon reaching the bedroom, she was met with a scene that no mother should ever have to face. Outside of the house, orange flames could be seen burning fiercely in the bedroom, with smoke billowing from the open window. Neighbors who saw the flames licking at the building bravely climbed across the roof with a garden hose. Aiming it at the window, they tried to quell the blaze, but sadly, it was to no avail. Luz desperately fought through the flames to open the bedroom door to where Delimar was sleeping. Fire and smoke obscured her vision, but through the wave of heat, Luz was certain that she could only see an empty crib, and the bedroom window was wide open. Locked in a state of panic, Luz's screams could be heard throughout the entire family home, as she desperately tried to save her 2 sons. Upon hearing her screams, 2 other neighbors bravely entered the house in an attempt to reach Delimar, but sadly, after reaching the top of the stairs, they were met with a 5-foot wall of flames. Firefighters arrived soon after and immediately got to work, but they would have to drag Luz away from the house as she screamed and cried for her baby. Pedro arrived at the scene shortly after this, and although it felt like a lifetime, the fire was actually contained and extinguished within 14 minutes. Although her sons had escaped the blaze unharmed, Luz would sustain burns to her hands and face from trying to reach Delimar's crib. She could not stop repeating the same words to firefighters, that someone had stolen her daughter. Unfortunately, no one believed her, but also, half understandably, they all blamed it on shock. Firefighters attempted to locate Delimar in the burnt-out shell of what once was the bedroom. However, they were unable to find anything that resembled human remains. And although a small yellow package was initially suspected to be Delimar, this was later proven to merely be bedding. The ignition source of the fire was eventually blamed on a home-rigged extension cord attached to a space heater near the baby's crib. A report concluded that no signs of arson were found, and that there was no reason to suspect foul play. Given the known flammable nature of extension cords with space heaters, it was entirely reasonable to believe that the two together could have started the inferno. Due to the fact that no body had been found, medical examiners were twice dispatched to the scene to find Delimar's remains, and this also included a forensic anthropologist. However, no human remains were ever located, and Delimar's body was presumed to be completely incinerated by the heat and severity of the blaze. But with no evidence of a body to be found, a death certificate could not be issued. Luz was understandably heartbroken, but saying that, she simply refused to believe her daughter had died in the fire. For a start, why was the cot empty? And why had the bedroom window been open on a freezing cold December afternoon? Put short, it simply made no sense. With her mother and father both refusing to believe that she had died, no funeral was ever held for Delimar. But as the days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and then months into years, hopes began to fade. The couple moved several times after the fire, and 2 years after the tragic event, they welcomed their 4th child into the world, a 3rd son named Samuel. Pedro often told co-workers that he didn't believe she was dead, and instead was kidnapped by someone close to the family. To add to this, it was around 2 years after the fire, and while attending a baby shower, that something very peculiar happened to Pedro. After arriving at the venue, he bumped into one of his distant cousins, Carolyn, who was also there with her daughter, Elia Hernandez. But when introduced to Pedro, he couldn't shake the feeling that her face and smile were extremely familiar, and something about this felt alarmingly uneasy. Now, perhaps it was her dazzling smile, or maybe it was because she was the same age as Delimar. Luz was doggedly persistent in her belief that Delimar was still alive, and the news that Pedro had told her left her absolutely ruthless. She would even go as far to ask Pedro for $500 so he could hire a private investigator. Now, sadly, Pedro didn't have anywhere near that kind of money, and he was barely able to keep the family afloat with his multiple jobs. Luz reached out to lawyers instead, but sadly, none of them would offer any help without a $100 per hour fee, which of course Luz simply didn't have. She felt entirely helpless and ignored by the state. Eventually, she became so miserable that in her grief, between December 2000 and March 2001, she sought counseling for her depression. And eventually, this ongoing trauma, stress, and grief put a serious strain on Luz and Pedro's relationship, and ultimately, the couple would finally split up. We're moving forward to January 2004. More than 6 years had passed since Delimar's death, with more than a year since Luz and Pedro had separated. Both Luz and her sister were attending a birthday party in Kensington, hosted by Pedro's sister Evelyn for her granddaughter. And also in attendance of this party were two familiar faces, Carolyn and her daughter Elia. With the party in full swing around her, Luz gazed over the group of children until suddenly she focused on one particular little girl. She had a broad smile, dark hair, deep brown eyes, and very distinctive dimples in her cheeks. Dimples that matched Luz's son. Now, Luz couldn't rationally explain her feeling at this moment, but deep down she knew that the girl she was staring at was in fact not Elia, and instead it was her very own daughter, Delimar. After a mere few minutes, Luz had formulated a rather smart plan in her mind, and after pretending that Elia had bubblegum in her hair, she tried to remove it for her. And while pretending to remove this bubblegum, she took some of Elia's hair and placed it in a paper napkin. Now, to most, this sounds absolutely crazy, and even to me, this sounds like quite a long stretch. But you see, Luz had watched one too many CSI episodes, and knew that one of the only ways she could prove this was her daughter was through some form of DNA test. Despite these tests costing several $100s and her story sounding batshit insane, she eventually persuaded a representative to get this test concluded. The test was scheduled, and what came back was an absolute shocker. The results were conclusive, and Elia Hernandez was in fact her daughter Delimar Vera. But this jaw-dropping revelation begged one huge question. What in the bloody hell was Delimar doing under the care of Carolyn? So, Carolyn Correa was Pedro's cousin by marriage, and although the two were friendly, they were not that close. Carolyn had 3 children from previous relationships, and reportedly had undergone a sterilization procedure. Upon getting into a new relationship with a man named Andrew Moore, he now wanted to have a baby with her, which was unfortunate as she was no longer able to. It is speculated that Carolyn suffered from a psychological disorder known as pseudocyesis, a condition where a woman will believe she is pregnant and may even experience symptoms of pregnancy despite not actually being so. It was not long before the fire in 1997 that Carolyn told several family members that she was around 8 months pregnant. And although several people raised their eyebrows, no extended questions were asked by anyone. On that fateful day, Carolyn had asked Pedro if he could repair her car, and as we know, during this time, she stayed in the home with Luz. It is speculated that, in this moment, she had found out about Delimar and concocted a plan. With Luz occupied with the housework, and Delimar almost the exact age to fit her fabricated pregnancy, Carolyn saw her one and only chance. And after sneaking upstairs, she smuggled the 10-day-old baby from the bedroom and out of the window. It's theorized she returned through the window without Delimar, left the house downstairs through the front door, and then returned moments later to say she had forgotten her purse. This was likely an excuse to ignite the fire, which, not long after she left the house, began to rage through the bedroom. After avoiding contact with the outside world for multiple days, Carolyn then returned home to Andre, where she claimed she'd given birth alone in her own home. She then filed for a birth certificate, dating Elia's birthday as January 6, 1998, and listed herself as the sole attendant to a home birth. She went on to move to Wellingborough in New Jersey, and spent the next 6 years raising Elia, lovingly entering her into pageants and various small acting roles. Interestingly, in 1999, Carolyn admitted to Andre that he wasn't actually Elia's father, and this was proven through a private DNA test, though why she decided to lie on top of her initial lies still remains unclear. Eliah's DNA test was groundbreaking, but to be sure, the state ordered a second test to be completed between Carolyn and Eliah. And as police began to look into Carolyn's background, they found some very concerning details. It is reported that back in the year 1996, while working as a town clerk for the Hamilton Township, she was found guilty of theft and was due to be fired imminently. However, in an attempt to destroy any evidence of this, she set fire to the office. Nobody was hurt in the blaze, and ultimately her plan failed. She was later charged with arson and embezzlement, receiving 5 years probation for her crimes. And obviously, this was now a major red flag for the police. Incredibly, Carolyn seemed to think that she could keep getting away with her lies. And just before the DNA sample was due to be taken from Eliah's cheek, Carolyn sprayed a solution into her mouth and told her not to swallow until after the swab. However, again, this attempt of sabotage failed, and when the DNA results came back, it was confirmed that Carolyn was not actually Eliah's mother. Carolyn fled immediately after the tests were taken, which ended up in a manhunt for the kidnapper. This too would fail, and she was eventually tracked down and arrested 3 days after she had fled, before being held on a $1 million bail. She was ultimately charged with kidnapping, arson, assault, concealing the whereabouts of a child, and interfering with the custody of a child. Before the trial date could be arranged, Luz was desperate to be reunited with her long-lost daughter. But this was a reunion that was of grave concern to psychologists. Given that the only mother Delimar had ever known was now proven to not actually be her mother, they had no idea what impact this could have on her trust for those close around her. To add to this problem was a language barrier. Luz was primarily a Spanish speaker, whereas Delimar had been raised in an English-speaking household. Anyway, these two issues were enough to greatly stress out Delimar's entire team of psychologists, and they would all have to just wait and see how this panned out. Following the news, Delimar was extremely upset. She screamed, cried, and shouted for her fake mother. But when child psychologists explained the story to her, she seemed to calm down. Eventually, Luz and Delimar scheduled to meet in a family room of social services, a common tactic with reunions such as this. Entering the room to finally be reunited with her daughter, Delimar jumped out from under the table and shouted, "Surprise!" Luz broke down. She cried, gently asking the 6-year-old, "Do you know who I am?" Delimar replied with, "You're my mum." Moving into legal proceedings, Carolyn's case began in 2005. Her defense team argued that she'd been suffering from pseudocyesis, and that, in her mind, she had truly believed that Delimar was her child. They also argued that Carolyn must have had an accomplice on the very night of the kidnapping, and tried their best to pin the blame on Pedro, who was Delimar's biological father. They further claimed that, because his name was not on the birth certificate, he did not want to have Delimar as his child, which, of course, was strongly denied by Pedro. The prosecution fought back at the defense, claiming Carolyn had shown willful and deliberate actions into stealing Delimar in a calculated manner, and through her selfish actions, had denied Pedro and Luz 6 years of their daughter's life and milestones. While it wasn't in question if Carolyn suffered from depression or not, the judge also noted that she was more manipulative than delusional, saying, "You robbed a small girl of a very great deal." Carolyn showed little remorse in court and only apologized for the confusion she had caused both families. However, the judge was not impressed, and Carolyn was sentenced to a minimum of 9 years behind bars for arson and abduction. She holds a maximum of 30 years, which is both understandable but also kind of crazy. Here on Coffeehouse Crime, we often see murderers get much less time than this. Legal proceedings didn't end here, however. Luz and Pedro would also try to sue the state for their poor handling of the case, though we don't actually know how this went. The rest of Delimar's life appears to have been a good one so far. Her name was legally changed back to Delimar, and she was raised by Luz alongside her 3 brothers. She is now a fully grown woman, is currently married to a man named Isaiah, and even has a son of her own now. Delimar currently works in HR for a rental company as a talent advisor, and if her Instagram is anything to go by, she now seems to have built a wonderful life for herself. If you're interested, you can find her at Delimar Vera. Carolyn served 9 years of her sentence, before being released on parole in 2013. Understandably, she has a lifelong ban on contacting Delimar or her family. It is not known where she is or what has happened in her life, but I hope that, whatever she is doing, she regrets and is remorseful for her actions. And I think that just about concludes our story today, folks, but I'd love to hear what you think about this case. Do you believe that Carolyn had an accomplice? Was Pedro actually involved, or just an innocent grieving father? And do you think Carolyn got enough time for her crimes? So I'll be diving into a few more typical true crime cases after this, but being honest with you, it was quite nice for the mind and soul not to cover a story with murder. Thank you again to Babbel for sponsoring today's video. If you'd like 60% off your subscription, then please click the link below or scan the QR code. And again, if you'd like to get early access to my videos, exclusive content, merchandise, and much more, please visit my Patreon channel, which I'll leave in the link down below. You can also follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Coffeehouse Crime or on Twitter at CoffeeHCrime. Anyway, I'll catch you again very soon for another video. But until that moment arrives, remember to look after yourself, look after each other, and of course, stay safe. Thank you, and goodbye.